Okay, welcome back. This is part two of my lecture about representation. And when we last left off, we were talking about why this particular painting, which at first probably to each of you seems completely unrepresentational, unless of course you think of it as a representation of large stripe shapes and large egg-like shapes, um, but seems unrepresentational. But then the more you think about it, the more you think about its history and its meaningfulness, in the sense that the artist who made it obviously had a sense of it meaning something specific to its title, then it does become a representation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about representation, and here we're just going to talk about how sometimes our assumptions about representation are off. We tend to assume that photography is automatically representational and automatically is going to be a real representation. But examine this photograph by Gursky, and especially if you imagined not seeing the top part of the photograph where you had the clues that showed you that this was actually a landscape, and that this is what Bahrain looks like, with the sky and a little bit of a sense of a settlement back there. And you just were looking at this road construction, which is so weird. Um, and it was just for the bottom two-thirds of the painting, or bottom two-thirds of the image. It would be easy to assume it was some kind of non-objective abstract painting instead of it being a photograph. And if you, but at the same time, this piece, not the photograph of Mylin's piece, but the actual work itself, the Vietnam Veteran Memorial, which at first probably looks like the exact opposite of representation, when you consider it, it's actually very much a representational piece in that it is a representation of the Vietnam War and of the history of the war, focusing on one specific aspect, the growing death toll of the war, and that the way that the wall expands in size as you walk down deeper and deeper into the earth, you're getting deeper and deeper into war, and eventually the number of deaths is so tall compared to you that it dwarfs you. The list of names on the wall. Um, but when you start out the walk, you're walking the wall seems small, the death toll seems minimal, and it is kind of a very specific type of representation of an event. We talked in class a little bit more about, in detail, about like the history of the Vietnam Veteran Memorial, about how some people opposed it, protested against it, the eventual decision to also have other sculpture showed, and we talked about the relationship of that to its representation, but we'll, we won't cover all of that. So one of my points is that, like like before, that representation in some ways almost can't be avoided. You make a painting and you put a mark down, and then to a degree, no matter what decision you make, someone is going to see it in some ways as a representation. I love this particular painting by Malevich, and it's one of my favorite paintings to argue about because everyone seems to have an opinion about it. Um, and one of the things, though, that in this particular case, the point that I want to make about it is just simply that here is an artist trying to make as simple a statement as possible, where it becomes nothing but a statement about the surface and about choosing shapes. It should be purely formal, and yet even still, people can't help but look at it and think that there must be some content beyond those formal decisions in there. The history of Philip Guston's painting is a really good example of that, of why he found that no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he tried to make his paintings be non-objective or at least be abstract, that people wanted to read into them narrative and story and representation. Um, that there is some sense that this is a thing, and that this is a thing, and that this and all of this is a space that those two things exhibit, inhabit, and because of that, that there is something going on. So, what is real representation? What is real? That's a pretty tough question. Um, here's an example of that. Right, this is a pretty famous painting. Some of you may know it, many of you may not. It's called The Treachery of Images, right, by Magritte, and if you don't know the French, what the French is saying is, this is not a pipe. And it's true. It's not a pipe because it is a painting, right? It's a flat two-dimensional thing. There is no actual pipe there. It's a representation of a pipe, but even more so if you really examine it, it's a very stylized representation of a pipe. So what the painting is saying is, don't assume that this is, don't assume that imagery is the same thing as the real thing. And also trying to remind you that all imagery is biased. And which is one of my points here. All representation, all imagery, any kind of representation is biased. Remember at the start of the class when we were looking at the Venus of Willendorf and how strange it looks to us, to our modern eyes. The particular characteristics that these artists emphasized seem weird, definitely seem to be in opposition to everything that we think is beautiful. But they were an expression of their values about what they thought was important, and that the things that they thought were important were the concepts of fertility, of the earth creating life. And so if you take that as the bias of the representation, it starts to become understandable why the artists made the decisions that they made. Here are 3 examples of artwork that are highly unreal in different ways, but seem very real, at least at first glance, to most viewers. In part, all of these create the impression of reality through photographic means. In the case of this painting by Richter, it's an exact photo reproduction painting, and he was very, very careful to reproduce the painting with this super smooth kind of surface, almost like a glass-like surface, so it has a super representational feel, but it is biased in that it's much more loyal to the biases of the camera, the blur of the camera, all of the distortions caused by the camera, than it is to reality, right? The way the camera flattens certain things out and makes this space kind of hard to read. The painting is very literally biased towards the biases of the camera rather than the biases of actually perceiving her. Like if he had painted her sitting there, he would have come up with a very different representation because it would have attempted more to understand. Whereas because it's a painting of a photograph, it's less about understanding and it's more about flattening. And in a similar way, this painting is also a photograph-based painting. We're pretty confident now that Vermeer used a photographic type device called a camera obscura. No photographic film was used back then, but it's a box, like a room kind of box, room-sized box that would project a light image onto his painting that he could then trace as he's putting down the shapes. And you can kind of see in his painting, he's breaking down what he's looking at in shapes, in a very similar way that a camera does. Now, this photograph is actually a photograph, and it's also far less realistic than it pretends to be. In this case, it's unrealistic in that she is creating a fake situation where she is wearing clothes and a costume and makeup that are designed to look like one time period when she's actually living in a completely different time period. She's choosing the architecture behind her to kind of create that feel so that it looks like a film still from a movie that might have been from the early 60s, even though she's doing it as a art project in the late 70s. Okay, that's the end of part 2.